A hospice nurse I once spoke with told me something I have never forgotten. She said the body rarely announces its final year with anything dramatic. It whispers. And most families, understandably, are not trained to hear a whisper. Today, I want to walk you through 7 of those quiet signals, the kind that rarely show up in a pamphlet from a doctor's office, but the kind that experienced caregivers learn to recognize after enough time spent sitting beside people in this particular season of life. The first sign is something families almost always describe the same way afterward, though they rarely notice it while it is happening. A person who once had a hobby they returned to faithfully, a garden, a workshop, a deck of cards, a favorite chair by a window where they did their crossword every morning, simply stops. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. The garden tools sit untouched in the shed for a season longer than usual. The crossword book stays on the same page for 2 weeks. This is different from ordinary tiredness or a bad week. It is a quieter kind of letting go, and it often happens well before anyone in the family realizes something has shifted. I think of a man named Gordon, who spent nearly every Saturday of his adult life restoring old radios in his garage, a hobby his grandchildren teased him about relentlessly, but secretly adored. In the last year of his life, his son noticed the garage light stopped coming on most weekends. When he asked about it, Gordon shrugged and said he just wasn't in the mood lately. His son assumed it was simply age catching up with him, slowing him down the way age slows everyone down eventually. Looking back, he wishes he had asked more questions instead of accepting the shrug at face value, because that quiet abandonment of something Gordon had loved for 50 years turned out to be one of the earliest signals of a decline that took another 8 months to fully reveal itself. What makes this particular sign so easy to overlook is that it rarely arrives as a clean, single decision. Gordon did not announce one day that he was finished with radios forever. He simply skipped one weekend, and then another, and by the time 3 months had passed, an entire season of a lifelong hobby had quietly disappeared without anyone marking the exact moment it happened. This gradual fading, rather than a sudden stop, is precisely why families so often miss it until they look back and realize how much time had actually slipped by. The second sign is one that catches families completely off guard because it can look, at first glance, like nothing more than an ordinary senior moment. New confusion, or old confusion suddenly getting noticeably worse, particularly in the late afternoon or evening hours. A person who has always known exactly what day it is suddenly asks twice within an hour. Someone who has lived in the same house for 40 years briefly seems unsure which hallway leads to the bathroom. This pattern, worse confusion later in the day, has a name among people who work in hospice and elder care. Some call it sundowning, though the exact cause remains only partly understood. What matters most for a family watching this happen is recognizing that a genuine, noticeable shift in orientation, especially one that follows a daily pattern, deserves real attention rather than a shrug and a joke about getting older. A woman named Carol described this happening with her mother in a way that still unsettles her when she talks about it. Her mother had always been the sharpest person in any room, the one who remembered everyone's birthday without writing it down. In her final months, Carol noticed her mother would be completely herself in the morning, laughing, engaged, perfectly clear, and then by early evening, she would ask where her late husband was, as though he might be arriving home from work any minute, decades after he had passed. Carol initially dismissed this as normal aging. It was only after mentioning it to her mother's doctor that she learned this specific daily pattern, clarity fading as the day wore on, is something clinicians watch for closely in this particular season of life. Carol later told me that what troubled her most in hindsight was how easily she had explained away each individual evening as simply a bad night, an off day, without ever stepping back to notice the pattern repeating itself night after night for weeks. It was only when her sister, visiting from out of town, mentioned the exact same thing happening during her own visit a few weeks earlier that the two of them finally compared notes and realized this was not an occasional slip, but a consistent, predictable shift happening nearly every single evening. The third sign involves the body rather than the mind, and it is one that is often noticed by someone helping with bathing or dressing before anyone else in the family sees it. A gradual, unmistakable loss of weight, without any diet, without any obvious illness driving it, simply flesh disappearing from a frame that has looked essentially the same for years. Clothes that fit properly for a decade suddenly hang loosely. Rings that never budged on a finger suddenly spin freely or slip off entirely. I want to be honest about why this matters so much in this specific context. Unintentional weight loss can have dozens of causes, many of them treatable, and I am not suggesting every case of it signals something as serious as what we are discussing today. But when it appears alongside several of the other signs on this list, when it happens gradually over months rather than a single sudden illness, it often reflects a body that has quietly begun redirecting its limited energy inward, away from maintaining muscle and tissue, toward simply keeping essential functions running. Families frequently describe noticing this first, not on a scale, which an older adult may resist stepping on anyway, but in the fit of familiar clothing, a belt that suddenly needs a new hole punched into it, a wedding ring that has to be taped to stay in place. The fourth sign is something that tends to alarm families the moment they notice it, and rightfully so, because it involves breathing itself. A short walk to the mailbox that once took no effort at all now leaves someone visibly winded. Climbing a single flight of stairs, something done without a second thought for decades, now requires a pause halfway up to catch their breath. This new shortness of breath with only minor exertion, particularly when it appears gradually over weeks rather than suddenly, often reflects a heart and set of lungs that are simply working less efficiently than they once did, circulating oxygen through the body with less power behind every beat and every breath. I remember hearing about a retired mailman, a man who had walked several miles a day delivering mail for over 30 years and remained an avid walker well into his 80s. In his final year, his daughter noticed he had started taking the short route on his daily walk instead of his usual longer loop, and even that shorter distance left him pausing at the same bench every single day, something he had never done before in all the years she had walked alongside him. He brushed it off as simply getting older. She later learned, once his heart's declining function was properly evaluated, that this specific and gradual reduction in his exercise tolerance had likely been building for the better part of a year before anyone treated it as more than ordinary aging. His daughter told me she had actually noticed the shortened route. Weeks before she noticed the pausing on the bench, but had chalked it up to simply preferring a quicker walk on a particular morning, the kind of small, reasonable explanation that makes perfect sense in isolation, but only reveals its true significance once you notice it repeating, week after week, without ever reverting back to the longer route he had walked so faithfully for decades. The fifth sign is a subtle one, easy to miss unless you happen to hold someone's hand regularly, which is precisely how many family members first notice it. A gradual coolness in the hands and feet, sometimes accompanied by a change in color, skin appearing slightly paler, or occasionally taking on a mottled, blotchy appearance, particularly on the legs and feet. This happens because, as the body's circulation becomes less efficient in this final season, Blood is naturally redirected toward the vital organs at the body's core, leaving the extremities, the hands, the feet, the fingertips, with somewhat less blood flow than they received in earlier years. A hospice volunteer once told me she learned to check for this simply by holding a patient's hand during a visit, something she did naturally out of warmth and companionship long before she recognized it as a clinical signal worth paying attention to. She described noticing, over the course of several months with one particular patient, that his hands, once always warm regardless of the season, had become noticeably cooler to the touch, even in a warm room, even under a blanket. She mentioned it to the visiting nurse, not as an alarm, simply as an observation, and the nurse nodded and said this was something they had already been tracking as part of a broader pattern they were watching closely. The sixth sign is one that families often attribute entirely to simple clumsiness or the ordinary unsteadiness so many people associate with getting older, but it deserves more specific attention than that assumption usually gives it. A noticeable increase in stumbles, near falls, or actual falls, particularly in someone whose gait had been stable and reliable for years beforehand. This is different from someone who has always been a bit unsteady on their feet. This is a genuine, new change. A person who has walked confidently through their own home for decades, suddenly catching themselves on furniture that has not moved from that spot in 20 years. A woman named Ruth told me about her father, a retired carpenter with remarkably steady hands and feet his entire life, a man who built an entire staircase in his own home by himself well into his 70s. In his final year, his daughter began finding small bruises on his arms and hips that he could never quite explain, and she started noticing him reaching for walls and door frames in a house he had lived in for 4 decades, a house he could have navigated blindfolded just a year earlier. This increased unsteadiness, she later understood, reflected changes happening throughout his entire body, his muscles, his balance, his blood pressure regulation, all beginning to decline in ways that showed up first, and most visibly in his simple ability to walk safely across his own living room. The seventh and final sign is the one I find most difficult to describe plainly, because it involves something that straddles the line between the physical and the deeply personal, and families often only recognize its full significance in hindsight: a tendency to quietly begin giving things away, or to bring up, almost in passing, who should have a particular item after they are gone. Not in a dramatic, tearful conversation, but almost casually, folded into an otherwise ordinary visit. A specific request that a granddaughter take a particular quilt, a comment that a certain fishing rod should go to a grandson who always admired it, a sudden, unprompted mention of where certain important papers are kept. I think of a woman named Josephine, who during what turned out to be her final Thanksgiving, spent nearly 20 minutes going through her jewelry box with her daughter, explaining the story behind nearly every piece, who had given it to her, what occasion it marked, and quietly suggesting which granddaughter might like each one someday. Her daughter enjoyed the conversation immensely at the time, treating it as a pleasant afternoon of storytelling, the kind grandmothers often enjoy sharing. It was only months later, after Josephine had passed rather suddenly from what seemed like an unrelated illness, that her daughter realized her mother had, in her own quiet and unhurried way, been saying goodbye to her belongings, and in doing so, saying goodbye to her family as well, long before anyone recognized what those 20 minutes had truly been. What struck her daughter most, thinking back on that afternoon, was how utterly ordinary it had felt in the moment, no different in tone from any other conversation the two of them might have shared over coffee. Josephine had not cried, had not spoken with any particular heaviness, had simply moved through her jewelry box the way she might have moved through old photographs, sharing memories with the same warmth she always brought to family gatherings. It was precisely that ordinariness her daughter later realized, that made it so easy to miss entirely as the goodbye it eventually revealed itself to be. I want to pause here and say something important. The same thing I believe deserves repeating any time we discuss signs like these. None of these 7 things, taken alone, means with any certainty that someone you love is entering their final year. People give away belongings simply because they are downsizing. People stumble more as they age without it signaling anything beyond ordinary wear on aging joints. People lose interest in a hobby simply because their interests have genuinely shifted. What matters is not any single sign in isolation, but a pattern, several of these signs appearing together, gradually over a period of months, alongside a general sense that something about a person's overall vitality has genuinely shifted. If you recognize several of these signs together in someone you love, I want to encourage you gently to bring this observation to their doctor directly and honestly, rather than assuming there is nothing to be done, or worse, avoiding the conversation entirely out of fear of what the answer might be. Hospice and palliative care exist precisely to bring comfort, dignity, and expert support to exactly this season of life, and involving these resources earlier, rather than only in the final days, allows for months of genuine quality time that families often deeply regret not having sought out sooner. I want to add something practical here as well, because families often ask what to actually say in this kind of conversation, both with a doctor and with the person they love directly. You do not need a clinical vocabulary or a perfectly worded script. Something as simple as, "I have noticed you seem more tired than usual, and I have noticed a few other changes too. Can I share what I have seen and ask what you think?" opens the door honestly without frightening the person you are speaking with. Most people, even in this season of life, sense on some level that something has shifted, and an honest, gentle conversation often comes as a relief rather than a burden, since it finally names something they may have been quietly noticing in themselves as well. I also want to speak directly to anyone watching this who suspects, quietly, that this season may already be beginning for someone they love. I know how much easier it feels to push that suspicion away, to keep hoping for improvement rather than sitting with what these signs might actually mean. But I want you to understand that noticing these signs and allowing yourself to take them seriously is not giving up on the person you love. It is choosing to be fully present with them, rather than distracted by denial in whatever time remains, however much or however little that turns out to be. There is a particular kind of regret that visits families only after someone has passed, the regret of recognizing, only in hindsight, signs that were there all along, conversations that could have happened, moments that could have been honored more fully had they only understood what season they were truly standing in. I share these 7 signs with you today so that you might be spared some measure of that particular regret, so that if this season has already quietly begun for someone in your life, you can meet it with open eyes, a soft heart, and the presence this time so deeply deserves. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this conversation gave you language for something you have been quietly noticing without quite knowing how to name it, I hope you will pass it along to someone else who might need to hear